Daniel Goleman explores the fascinating world of social intelligence and how our brains are naturally designed to connect with others. This book examines the scientific research in neuroscience that reveals important truths about human behavior and relationships. The author explains that social intelligence involves developing emotional skills that come from our brain's neural circuits. When we understand these processes, we can shape how we express emotions to build healthier connections with other people. The book is organized into 6 main sections that examine how emotional skills affect individuals, families, and workplace groups. Goleman demonstrates that the quality of our relationships is essential for living a happier and more secure life, and that healthy social connections create balanced environments where people can learn and grow together. Uncovering a new science. Goleman begins by introducing the field of neuroscience and explaining how we create neural bridges with the people we interact with. He makes an important point that our most meaningful exchanges happen with the people we spend the most time with. Our relationships actually change both our experiences and our biology. We constantly influence others, and they influence us in return. The ability to recognize and manage these emotional exchanges determines how socially intelligent a person or group becomes. The book also looks at how technology affects human interactions. Today, communication devices have become like extensions of our bodies. Goleman warns about the danger of what he calls social autism, which happens when we replace real human contact with purely virtual interactions. This is why he believes studying neuroscience is so important for developing social intelligence that supports genuine and healthy relationships. Programmed to connect. In this section, Goleman explores what he calls the emotional economy and how it influences our quality of life. Our experiences shape how we behave, and these experiences directly affect our basic emotions. The most primitive part of our brain controls our survival instincts. This area contains the amygdala, which is a brain structure responsible for our emotions. In contrast, the prefrontal cortex is the rational part of the brain. Goleman uses the terms main road and shortcut to describe how the cortex and amygdala work together in developing social intelligence. Our choices can be heavily influenced by either of these brain areas. When we can identify the emotional triggers that throw us off balance, this shows social intelligence. Similarly, recognizing when we mirror another person's behavior or situation also demonstrates good reasoning skills. Understanding these brain processes helps us make better decisions in our relationships. Broken bonds. Goleman introduces 2 important concepts for understanding relationships. He uses the terms I-thou to describe authentic connections and I-it to describe relationships that are purely self-interested. When we disconnect from others in our relationships, we can start to objectify them, meaning we fail to form real bonds. When we operate in I-it mode, we treat other people as a means to achieve some other goal. However, in I-thou mode, the relationship with the other person becomes valuable in itself. The search for individuality without becoming selfish is a process that requires self-knowledge. As humanist thinkers have suggested, how our brain receives information is crucial for our relationships. Sometimes we engage in psychic transference, projecting our own desires or problems onto others. There can also be countertransference when the other person reflects their feelings back to us. The quality of these emotional exchanges depends on how sensitive our neural centers are throughout our lives. The first years of life, when brain structures are forming, are especially important in determining our behavior patterns. Goleman explains that people with low resilience experience rejection as physical pain because our brain processes these feelings in the same area. How we record emotions becomes the foundation for healthy or unhealthy personalities. Narcissists, manipulative people, and psychopaths are indifferent to other people's feelings and represent the I-it concept. Science has shown that these individuals have problems in the brain center that reads emotions and in the prefrontal cortex area that controls impulses. Feelings like regret, shame, and guilt are social and moral emotions that separate these unhealthy, selfish personalities from healthy ones. People who have developed neural circuits that register emotions feel empathy and can understand other people's pain. Creation and nature. This chapter starts with an encouraging message that genes are not destiny. Although we inherit certain biological neurotransmitter patterns, Goleman explains that as neuroscience advances, we learn that gene expression can determine our psychological foundations. The author discusses epigenetic studies that show how our experiences change how our genes function without changing our DNA sequence. Goleman supports the idea of social epigenetics, which shows how our environment programs our genes to determine their activity level. For this reason, the author concludes that a major influence on forming neural centers is the amount of love or cold neglect that a child receives. According to Goleman, the first connections made in a neural circuit become stronger every time the same pattern is repeated, until these pathways become so strong that they create automatic responses and establish new circuits. It is important to understand that neural networks that are not used frequently tend to weaken and disappear. Although we create neurons most rapidly during childhood, we continue producing them throughout our lives until old age. This characteristic of neural plasticity explains how we can create new pathways through learning experiences throughout our entire lives. However, the author emphasizes how important early experiences are for forming our basic neural circuits. This happens because once the prefrontal cortex is fully developed in early adulthood, it becomes difficult to reshape certain circuits, especially emotional ones. The patterns recorded in our emotion centers, which are regulated by the prefrontal cortex, tend to become more fixed and stable as we mature. The varieties of love. The author examines different types of love from a neural perspective and explains how important these circuits are for developing healthy relationships. Goleman tells us that neuroscience identifies separate neural networks for attachment, caregiving, and sexual attraction. These are the biochemical elements that travel through different brain circuits to express these feelings, which develop before our rational brain emerges. The chemistry of love is connected to the production of specific hormones like dopamine, which affects the male brain when he sees an attractive woman. From a biological standpoint, dopamine activates a circuit that creates pleasure. A mental shortcut controls these impulses. However, conversation and getting to know each other through the brain's main highway creates more solid relationships. Regarding how long relationships last, Goleman explains that attachments can show how much we connect with people we love. However, they can also become addictive when we are controlled only by neural circuits, whose hormones work like drugs. All positive interactions with people activate parts of the brain responsible for feelings of satisfaction. This is the same circuit that responds to harmful substances like heroin and other addictive drugs. The natural pleasure we feel when we connect with others creates these neural patterns. Therefore, depending on a child's interactions in the first years of life, they will develop either more empathy and feelings of security, or fear and insecurity as behavioral tendencies in relationships with others. This neural foundation creates behavior patterns that are often unconscious. However, these patterns are decisive for the psychological and social profile that people will express, making them either more secure and independent or more avoidant, anxious, and emotionally dependent. Although modern life has disrupted many of our habits, our emotional centers still control us in many biological processes. Nature wisely programs brain centers for attraction to the opposite sex, using smell to release pleasure hormones and ensure reproduction of the species. Oxytocin is a chemical substance that activates the caregiving instinct. It is more present in the female brain, which explains maternal instinct. This is the neurochemistry of love, according to Goleman. The author also explains that imbalances in these neural centers can lead to behaviors that objectify others. This makes the healthy functioning of prefrontal systems essential, as they help control both sexual and aggressive impulses. Goleman concludes that this brings us back to the need for the main road and its ability to control the shortcut, providing balance against our basic drives. Healthy connections. The social brain is the missing biological link that science needed to biochemically prove how relationships affect us, both positively and negatively, says the author. In very stressful situations, for example, the adrenal gland releases cortisol, one of the hormones activated when the limbic brain identifies emergencies that could even threaten our lives. The problem is that brain chemistry cannot tell the difference between real danger and abstract danger that only exists in our minds. Generally, we need moderate levels of cortisol. However, if our cortisol levels stay high for too long, our body suffers health problems. According to Goleman, the amygdala circuit becomes overactive, and the prefrontal area cannot control its overly reactive signals. This is one of the conditions that leads to post-traumatic stress that many people develop after very emotionally draining experiences. It is a physical response to extremely threatening situations. The problem, according to Goleman, is that this can drain resources from the immune and endocrine systems, encouraging the development or worsening of diseases. This is where the effects of interpersonal relationships in our lives become important. Living with people who have little empathy can be considered toxic and can interfere with brain chemistry, affecting our mental state enough to make us sick if we are not emotionally able to block these influences. On the other hand, the author explains, strong social connections push us toward positive moods, balancing the release of hormones that work in our neural circuits. Social consequence. Goleman explains the biological causes of physical and emotional exhaustion. The brain activates emergency plans, and we tend to act more through mental shortcuts than through careful thinking. The amygdala demands attention from the prefrontal cortex, which also begins to react defensively, encouraging our automatic responses as if we lose the ability to think clearly. We need to balance our stress levels and cortisol production. Too much of this hormone damages the learning process and our performance as social beings. Goleman says that we function best when we have the right amount of motivation and concentration. Socially intelligent leaders, or anyone who serves as a role model such as parents and teachers, can help those under their guidance develop properly. On the other hand, extremely demanding environments where negative interactions happen most frequently can greatly reduce individual abilities and harm performance. This is why it is important for leaders to develop empathy and listening skills. This way, they establish productive connections that provide security. Advances in neuroscience should help people strengthen these authentic I-thou connections, suggests Goleman. We urgently need to develop these social skills to avoid relationships that ignore the well-being of others. In summary, the author argues that only this gives real meaning to life. He gives the example of the Kingdom of Bhutan in the Himalayas, where the main economic measure is not gross domestic product, but rather the country's gross domestic happiness index. Any economic and social system without compassion leads to meaningless relationships and great damage to the emotional economy. Based on this understanding, Goleman believes there is still hope. The new science of social intelligence gives us tools for collective action, building neural networks that support a society of people who truly connect and work for the common good. Daniel Goleman concludes that general intelligence comes from social intelligence, and neuroscience proves this connection. People who experience chronic stress, even though they consider themselves socially active, may actually be destroying their abilities and reducing their performance because they do not understand the importance of developing social and emotional skills. Our society still places too much value on excessive work and quantity of production rather than the quality of that production. The lack of empathy and compassion for others' well-being can cause serious damage to a society's emotional economy. People with poor emotional intelligence are more likely to experience frustrating and toxic relationships and develop serious health problems.